Points in this speech, I'm going to walk you through the incentives of large companies like Disney specifically, their ability to carry out said incentives, and I'm going to compare what happens then when we break them up. But first, before we continue, let's talk about the mechanism in play over here. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to have separate constituent studios with their own name: Marvel, Pixar, Lucasfilm Studios. And should their individual market shares grow excessively beyond what it is to allow competition or fair laws and things like that, we think it's fine to consider reducing or diminishing them in size and further breaking them up more in future, should that come to be. Meanwhile, Disney itself can be retained as a brand for the original Disney characters, such as the Disney princesses, Mickey Mouse, the family-friendly ones that first came into play and gave Disney its name. So I'm going to cover several things here on retaining viewership, on improving diversity and changing the fabric of society, as well as, first question though. So what's so bad about Disney? Now, several things that you have to understand here. First of all, Disney, if it's really a clarification, feel free.
I'm just wondering what's going to happen to products where a lot of studios are working together. For example, Disneyland, which has rights from Star Wars, rights from Marvel.
Thank you. So Star Wars has existed as its own franchise prior to Disney, separate too. So presumably, the way all mergers and breakups happen is that you have contracts which divide who gets what shares, who gets what rights or materials, who makes what profits. I'm sure they have a way to distribute that. If you can merge companies, you can break them up. It happens all the time. Not what the meat of the debate is about. What it is instead is several things. Now, Disney as a company historically, right, like they have had a history of restricting the themes and the values that they show to them. Why is that? Like, it's kind of obvious. As a family-friendly, several prongs. For one thing, as a family-friendly image that they have to project, right? It means essentially that the clientele that they cater to, the people who buy their products for their kids, the people who bring their kids to the amusement parks and all that are primarily from the older generation with a different set of values. They're primarily people who have grown up in more conservative times. They're primarily people who simply might reject new ideas or different things. And even if you were to say like, okay, the world we're living in is more progressive or something like that, things like that are less likely today, bear in mind that whenever Disney has introduced new progressive values, it has done so when it was popular to do so. Take Star Wars, for example. Rey, excellent character, my inspiration. When did she come about? Women were already empowered. Take, for example, Finn. They featured a black character. Well done. When did he come about? When they already had a space in society. Before that, Disney had themes of showing blackface in Mickey Mouse and different cartoons that they had. Before that, Walt Disney was famously outspoken against homosexuals and the LGBT community, and his work has seeped into its legacy. In fact, a lot of the rules that they have regarding the material that they produce and distribute was still inherited from those times, because he's written it such into their contracts, into the company ethos, that these are the continuing things which happen. And in fact, one important thing about what makes Disney so bad, there are two mechanisms here. First of all, their mechanism is their ability to lobby. Because they're such a large company, they can lobby more effectively simply because they have larger, better resources. Now, the amount that you make from the amusement parks, or like, take for example the fact that they have amusement parks all over the world. They bring in people to visit those parks, like to Paris, to Hong Kong and all of that. They boost tourism there, which means they can have links with the local government over there, because they're boosting literally the tourism that happens in those countries, right? So they can always ask for concessions and stuff. So many people visit Paris or Hong Kong simply to go to Disneyland, right? And given how much money they bring in, like how one ticket alone is $90 US, that instantly means like the amount of revenue is not like something you can dismiss in terms of how much like lobbying power they can have and stuff. No, thank you, not yet, right? So they have a lot of resources. They also have a lot of lawyers, and these lawyers work really hard for them to do several things. One, to extend copyright laws, because like basically they do a lot of lobbying for copyright laws, and they restrict the access to public domain. If you've been employed as an artist by Disney, all your work that you produce while you're in employment with them, even if you're drawing in your spare time, creating stories in your spare time, instantly belongs to Disney. Now this straight away restricts the creativity that you can have in the different stories and all that you can have out there. But also importantly, the second mechanism at play here is that because they're so large, they have the ability to then homogeneously shape the culture that happens. Now, it wouldn't be a problem if like you're having just a few types of stories from one company, if it's like one small company. But when Disney, specifically, something which owns 40% of all media produced and is growing, restricts the themes that can be produced, right? Even if you say, well, they might be producing like good themes or something, given how the fabric of society is changing and stuff, fact is, you're still having less diverse views, because it's going to be a homogeneous viewpoint from one company that shapes and restricts what people produce from it, right? Secondly, the other things that they lobby for is that they prevent unionization, and they also enforce stricter and harsher conditions for labor law and things like that, right? No, thank you. So there are a lot of problems that can come from having companies so big that they have the ability to influence governments like this. Now, smaller studios in comparison will have less of a lobbying power in order to do that, and they might not have so much of an interest in doing that because they might not need to protect the family-friendly brand image. They might not need to cater to more conservative generations and stuff like that the way that Disney specifically has to, which means that this power to do so is necessarily reduced with smaller studios. We're not saying they don't have any lobbying power at all. If you have a lot of money, chances are you can convince a government in some ways, but it's definitely going to be reduced compared to something which owns 40% of all media. No thank you, right? So now, another question that might come up is basically, okay, so also smaller studios would have less of an ability to force directors and writers to abide by their messaging, right? Which is another point of that. So now another thing which might happen is the question, rebuttal will probably be, oh, but you're not going to attract viewership, or it's harder to sell groundbreaking minority stuff and like that, so you're not going to get the diversity you want to see in progressive values. Now, several contentions with these. First of all, why are the movies which feature diverse characters actually rated well? For one thing, the Star Wars, Marvel, all of those already have a long time viewer base outside of Disney, right? So even if you were to break them up, given that we're breaking them up and they're allowed to retain their name, their own original like logos and things like that, they're still going to have their viewer base. They're not going to really have a backlash because people don't really care who owns the money from like the movies they make and stuff like that. And second thing, you because of well-curated stories, which are still possible when it's broken up, it's quality content. Things you get better off when you're not restricting creativity, when you're not being like censorship, when you're not practicing censorship and stuff like that, right? Third thing, it's because it tends to be in line with societal values or trend, which Disney is not always on point on and has shown to fail that from stuff like that before, right? So essentially on retaining viewership, it's not so much the Disney name which brings in viewers to separate studios. Fact, Lone Ranger tanked. Marvel, Star Wars, they were popular even before Disney. Essentially, if you have a large company like Disney dictating all of the media content that you consume, it's safe to say that the messages that you get might not exactly be more diverse or progressive, but in line with what they want. Thank you.
Look, we believe that governments to some degree have to work on some principles and provide similar rules and frameworks to every single company, right? So opening government has to show to us when it is legitimate to actually break companies up and when those point is crossed and why Disney has crossed it. We believe just saying they didn't provide enough diversity isn't good for governments to interfere at a point where entertainment companies are here to provide entertainment and not to fix social issues, right? We believe that it's not necessarily gov's right to burden companies with doing so when it should be government's job to do so. But we will take them up on what they want to talk about anyway and explain how we get more diversity on our side of the house, right? First of all, we believe that quite a lot of diversity already exists within Disney, right? We believe that still different groups within Disney like don't all produce the same things, but have taken some stuff with them, even if they were taken over by Disney, even if what OG says is true and Disney has like put in their own ideas into those companies. They probably still took a lot of their employees with them, right? They haven't kicked anyone out, which means the spirit of those old companies still exists, right? And is probably still there to some degree. Literally all the bad Disney stuff that opening government gives you, like blackfacing, has happened in the 60s, right? We don't believe that that is comparative at the status quo, right? They say that literally every single liberal character or diverse character that Disney has because they bought it from another company. Well, we say Disney choose to buy it, which is a good thing, right? It probably shows more good incentives other than bad, but also we'd like to deny that that is true, right? Because Disney is producing more and more diverse characters, like having a black Ariel in its new production, right? Like having a black character in Kiss the Frog, right? We see those things already happening. We believe in order to explain how someone or how a company, for that sake, is acting, we need to show two things. First of all, the incentive to do so, and secondly, the ability to do so, right? And we believe that both is stronger if Disney is a big corporation rather than a lot of small things, right? So first of all, on the incentive, right? Disney knows that there is a growing market for diverse characters, and it is like it wants to tap that new market to make sure that it is staying the biggest media and entertainment corporation, right? They have recognized that that is a good new market to go in, and as I've shown in my examples, they currently already do so, right? But we believe they have a bigger incentive to create more diverse characters than small companies that would have been breaking up would do, right? Because small companies would want to compete against each other, right? They have the opportunity to expand and grow bigger and bigger by competing to each other, right? There's more for those small companies to gain by competing over the mainstream market than there is for Disney, right? Because Disney already has the mainstream market, so it has to tap new markets, right? It has to tap growing markets in other countries and therefore represent not only rich white people, but other groups as well, right? Because that is literally the only way in which Disney could still expand, right? Covering different groups of people. Let's talk then about the ability to be progressive. Given that opening government has failed on a comparative, why small companies actually have more of an incentive than Disney, but let's assume they do, right? Let's then look at what ability they have to be progressive, right? Look, producing a movie when you're not certain that that movie is going to be good and consumed by a lot of people is a very big risk, right? One big movie, a bad movie at the point where it costs millions to produce can be a massive financial risk to smaller companies, even if they are able to cover it, right? Even if we talk about the Marvel Studios and they're still quite big, right? $1 million production that is a complete fail still costs you a lot of investment, still makes you lose 4 or 5% on the market, and makes your shares drop significantly, right? That is a big impact for companies. That is something they care a lot about, right? Which means that Disney is much more likely to take the risk because they're able to cover those risks, right? But also because the risk in and of itself is smaller, right? Because there is this Disney franchise behind it that people trust to be good, that people are willing to go to the cinemas for, right? Especially when Disney probably has a lot of deals with cinemas all around the world and can be shown that those movies will inevitably be shown in the cinema, even if it isn't the greatest and best movie it has ever been produced. Something a small company can't rely on. But before I go on closing.
Name Disney's most recent big risk.
Well, I mean, Pixar has produced a lot of small movies as well, right, that have its name. Like, if you think about going to the cinema, even if you watched a small movie, right, you still have that Pixar thing at the beginning, right? It's just like a lot of people don't necessarily associate it with Disney at a point where it's not like the classic Disney characters, right? Right, but let's say even small companies do it well. We still believe that Disney is going to do it better than those small companies because A, they have more money and more actors and directors, but even if they do it badly, right, it still generates much more money than if a small company did it, right, because they, as I said, can advertise for it much better. They have deals with cinemas all around the world. They have much bigger markets, which means that at least those new risks that they're taking aren't be seen as a massive failure for everyone else, where people think it's not worth it to do those things. It's not worth it to diversify, right? Because other companies are looking at what Disney is doing and whether it is successful or not, right? But lastly, even if Disney doesn't do anything good, we believe that Disney at least has a very strong incentive to not do anything bad and not piss anyone off, right? Because while it may have the ability to cover for one movie that people don't watch, it can't afford to piss off entire markets at the point where that is literally the only way in which they can expand, right? Which means misrepresenting people of color is a very big risk for Disney to take, right? It's probably not something they want to do because they know they'd piss off millions of people and entire markets for them, right? Which is, as they've experienced with Pocahontas, that was produced like 20 years ago and whitewashed, people are still pissed off about, right? People still are angry at Disney for doing so, right? But at the point where you break Disney up, smaller companies can afford to target one specific audience. They're probably going to be rich by focusing on one single country, which means it doesn't matter if they piss anyone in another country off, right? It doesn't matter if they piss anyone else off at a point where they focus on Star Wars fans, which means we probably get the good things, but at least we don't get the very bad things. Very proud to post.
And now can invite the second speaker for the other.
We think that Disney's size gives it an effective monopoly in the entertainment industry, which is expanding, and enormous lobbying power, which we think is unacceptable. Okay, I want to respond firstly to some stuff coming out of opening opposition. So this idea that we have to be consistent with when we break up large companies, sure. We'll be consistent when these companies threaten to have a monopoly over whatever industry they're in, or an effective monopoly at least. We'll be willing to do this at the point where their enormous lobbying power is able to influence the decisions of government to the detriment of the people of the country that these corporations are operating in. That's fine. I'd even be happy to just say we break up any corporations over a certain size. Whatever. Okay, regarding this idea that people are going to go to like films for the Disney brand, and you're going to lose that, and people aren't going to go see these films. I think firstly this is just untrue. I think actually people go because they believe in the individual studio's ability. Right? When I go to see a Pixar film, I trust that Pixar, the studio, is what is good and what is going to make that a good film, not the Disney corporation as a whole. Right? Note that I like Star Wars, but I might not like Marvel. I actually like both, but there might be some people who feel that way, right? I don't think that you have to buy into the entire Disney brand. Okay, but even if it is true, I think you still then get worse films because people are willing to go and see a film just because it has the Disney logo associated with it, Disney's name associated with it, which means that you get lazier filmmaking. I think that's actually kind of an important impact because ultimately, I think we're talking about the entertainment industry, and I think that what we value significantly is getting good media out of this. I think this diversity clash is largely symmetrical, though I think that it does fall somewhat to our side, in that the financial incentives apply to both sides. I'll point out that Disney can make small films with small budgets. They can fund small film that is targeted to specific audiences. The difference is they can also fund large films. However, also Disney has historic image to maintain, as Shahira talked about, historic structures that means that it's more likely to fail to be revolutionary. I don't think Get Out would have come out of Disney. Okay, I'm going to quickly address closing's thing about the theme parks. Worst case, honestly, I think we happily accept no more Disneyland. It's probably not that important compared to Disney's massive lobbying of intellectual property law in the US, which has kind of destroyed the state of intellectual property worldwide. But also, realistically, what we actually probably get is shared merchandising deals in the way that Sony shares Spider-Man with Disney under the status quo. Right? I think that these separate studios can work together and recognise that they benefit from this without having a centralised authority dictating things to them. Okay, cool. How does Disney have a monopoly? So firstly, they own most of the popular media franchises today. Things like Star Wars, like Marvel, like Pixar, like Disney Animation Studios. This gives them an enormous cultural influence. I'll note that something like 8 out of the top 10 highest grossing films of all time are Disney films. I think the other 2 are James Cameron. They have enormous cultural and as a result, economic influence, right? They're able to buy out other companies. Note that they recently did this with 20th Century Fox. Prior to this buyout, I think there were 5 major production companies operating out of Hollywood: Disney, Paramount, Universal, Sony, and Fox. Now there are 4. This is Disney is planning on continuing to do this. They want to expand. They're able to compound at the point where they gain more franchises, more access to merchandise, more access to intellectual property, and the ability to gain more money. They can buy out more and more franchises, right? I think that's potentially problematic. Finally, they're also able to use their enormous cultural power to influence public perception of like jointly owned property. So specifically, for example, the portrayal of Spider-Man in the MCU was targeted in such a way, like the way that he looks up to the Avengers and idolizes Iron Man and all that, like specifically is targeted in such a way that it undermines like Sony's other portrayals of Spider-Man, makes them unprofitable, makes it more likely that Sony are going to be willing to let Disney take full control of the Spider-Man IP. Okay, cool. So what's the result of a monopoly? So firstly, we think that centralized control essentially means you have an ability to charge whatever you want for your films, right? You know, when you're producing 40% of media and about 80% of good media, I think that means that no cinema in their right mind is ever going to say, no, we won't pay Disney's prices, we won't show Disney's films, because you're just not going to be able to like remain in business at that point, right? That means that they can just charge whatever they want for cinemas to rent their films. They can charge whatever they want for merchandise and things, because they have an effective monopoly there, right? Secondly, I think it means that workers have a lack of ability to go and work elsewhere, which means that when they're treated shittily, all right, given that they have certain skills that make them, for example, like animators or whatever, I think that means that they have less of an ability to go and work. Because they can't go and work elsewhere, they have to put up with shittier conditions. That means they can be treated worse. I'll take you in a minute. Finally, it means that Disney can control the cultural conversation as overall. That means that when they have pernicious messaging, like Shahira talks about, with regards to like a lack of diversity or only diversity when they're forced to accept it, right? I think they're able to like have a massive cultural influence there in a way that is damaging. They are also able to use that to further consolidate their monopoly. I'll take closing.
Okay, so a lot of your analysis depends on it being a monopoly and there being no alternative choice. Note that you admit that there are 3 other massive studios. Your partner admits Disney only owns 40%. There's still alternatives. There's still Sony. There's still
Sure.
Netflix.
Okay, yes, that is true. But given that like most of these studios produce shit, like I'm sorry, but like nobody's going to go and watch DC. There's a reason why these studios are doing poorly, and Disney is doing well. But note also that by the analysis that I gave earlier, this monopoly is going to get worse over time as they're able to consolidate their power through the mechanisms I outlined, right? All of this gets worse. It's likely that in the next 20 years, we probably see like 60, 70% of media being produced by Disney, maybe even more, right? Finally, enormous lobbying power, right? Like massive amounts of capital that Disney has by virtue of being this enormous conglomerate, and massive amounts of cultural and political influence that comes along with that, the ability to pay for massive legal teams, effectively means that they're able to lobby governments really effectively. Okay, that means that they are able to do things like they've done with the copyright law, where they've extended the like intellectual property deadline, basically the time until something goes into a public domain consistently, which means that nothing new has entered the public domain since about 1928. Right, that's hugely detrimental to like our ability to generate new stories, our ability to reinterpret old stories in ways that that maybe remove some of the problematic messaging that comes along with them. I think also, given that Disney's brand is specifically built on like originally on these public domain stories like Snow White, like Little Mermaid or whatever, the fact that now Disney has made that a finished version that we're not allowed to reinterpret is also problematic. Finally, it means they are able to just lobby for shit working conditions, stop trade unions. All these reasons mean that Disney is pretty awful. Let's stop them.
I will let you finish the speech, and I'll close my second speaker.
Most of my speech will be analyzing what kind of incentives Disney has and why those incentives are probably going to be used in a way that is going to be better for society at large. Before that, let's look at like opening government. What does opening government actually stand for, right? We try to be fair. I tried to ask a POI to PM, I wasn't taken. My partner tried to be fair and asked them, what is the point at which a state is legitimate to start intervening, and why does Disney cross that point? The answer that comes out in the PM is literally that, you know, it's fine to break up any company over a certain size. If that is the debate they want to have, that should have been the debate propped by Prime Minister to give us a chance to engage and to give closing half a chance to engage with that, right? Given that they didn't just prop this as, any company over X size and then let us know what that X size is and why Disney crossed it so we can engage with that, I think we just get a lot of wishy-washy things on it's generally bad if companies become too big, right? And they just kind of claim Disney is a monopoly because it owns a lot of very popular brands, right? Problems with that. A lot of very popular brands are stuff like Harry Potter that is owned by Warner Bros, which by the way is another studio about, another conglomerate of studios about the size of Disney that also keeps buying up a lot of different media companies, right? Yes, to some extent, it is true that there is a lot of power in media and in entertainment consolidated in the hands of companies. However, that is the reason because media as a whole is an oligopoly because of the fact that it is so fucking expensive to produce a movie. It is so hard to have deals with cinemas all over the world to be able to distribute them, and on top of it's just very hard to make profit margins by running a cable news channel, especially in the 21st century where there is so much disruption coming from the internet. You know what else is threatening this monopoly? Netflix, for example, probably has also a giant market share, probably also controls a lot of how films and entertainment are being distributed, also produces a lot of its own content, right? So all of the arguments on side opening government on how there is not enough competition to hold Disney accountable is just nonsense, right? My partner gets a POI from closing government of when's the last time did Disney took a risk? I'm not sure exactly how many weeks ago they announced that the next Ariel would be a woman of color, but it was not longer than a month ago, right? I think that is a pretty large risk that shows that Disney already has a lot of incentives to move away from its past. So all of the arguments on opening government on, but look, in the 20s, they did shit that we wouldn't see culturally acceptable now. My answer to that is one, yes, they did, but we are still holding them accountable for that, which means that they have a lot of incentives to not do that. And B, any single company that was active at the time probably became popular and was able to amass capital and keep existing because it was catering to their time. I'm unsure why that in itself is a reason for the state to intervene in the present to break up that company, right? But even if it did, probably Disney would still have those popular characters and would still have the history of having done some bad stuff in the past. So what is your logic? I'm not sure. It's bizarre. Okay, I'm on opening opposition, we think that the reason why Disney is so popular is because consumers ultimately have the right to choose what it is they want to support or not, right? I think it's fair for opening government to say that because you're a large media company, you have a bigger influence in controlling the discourse and the pop culture and the media discourse and whatever. However, I reject the fact that you can just do so in a way that is outrageous, right? Because given that we live in the age of social media, in which, by the way, Facebook owns most of social media, and you have nothing against Facebook, right? But that probably means that there is a lot of leverage on the side of consumers that they can apply to Disney, and Disney is awfully aware of that, which is why we see it shifting more and more towards being progressive and trying to cater to them, right? Katrin gives you two broad arguments, right? First, it tells you it has the incentive to tap new markets, and then secondly, it tells you it cannot upset a lot of people. Now, I understand that it might seem a bit contradicting that it will be progressive while trying to not upset a lot of people. So let me explain to you, those arguments by Katrin are completely unrebutted. So I'm not gonna bother adding analysis to that, right? Because I think they stand at this point in the debate, and I think they were pretty well proven. I'm going to talk about how they interact, right? Because it has the incentive to tap new markets, and we've already established that there's quite a lot of competition. And even if not from another studio that is just like Disney traditionally, at least from Netflix or any other type of disruption from social media, Disney does have a lot of incentives to tap new markets that will tend to be progressive, because progressiveness seems to be a goal that opening government has set as the metric for good in this debate. That probably means that Disney cannot afford to not tap into those markets, right? The response in DPM is just, well, it can also make small budget films. Our answer to that, yes, it can. It probably will. It probably will make a lot more of them, meaning that any sort of person in one niche will get a lot more content catered to them specifically because Disney has the financial power to absorb losses, right? How does this translate into the way Disney will use its influence probably to shift the consumer towards more progressiveness? Katrin gave you the analysis on why it simply cannot shift it towards being more oppressive, simply because it will create a very violent backlash, right? There is very little incentive for people of a certain inclination to riot against, something being a bit more progressive towards a female princess slaying dragons, right? There's very little incentives. However, there are very large incentives for people of color or for LGBTQ people who feel that they have been massively attacked by such a powerful company to riot, which probably means that there are already enough checks on Disney. First, in terms of the consumers, they will stop buying their product, but secondly, also in terms of competition and alternatives. Closing, do you have a POI? Okay. How it's going to, you just had a chance to engage with us, right? How it's going to use it, how it's going to use its power to appeal to masses without upsetting people that might be a bit radical and might have been, the constituency of Disney that OG claims they were a while ago, right? The thing is that it does have incentive to push barriers, but it has the incentives to do that in small, subtle ways, right? Which probably means that what it's going to do is it's going to still portray feminist topics in its movies, or have a very nice, very prominent female superhero. It's probably not going to go very far as to trigger the far right to launch a very large backlash for them. But what they achieve is, specifically by not alienating a lot of people that aren't already on the side of one particular topic, it makes it more palatable to them, right? It basically gets them on our side bit by bit. We think that there is no analysis on opening government why small studios will necessarily do better. We think there is no analysis on opening government other than assertions that Disney, controlling the cultural discourse is necessarily a bad thing. Disney's most popular movies that they quote are just toothless movies about a nice rat getting ahead meritocratically in cooking. I'm unsure why that movie does anything. I'm unsure why consumers enjoying that is a bad thing. Please do not break up Disney.
Okay, are you ready? Let's go. Okay, so I've three main points of substantive. I have risks, stifling creativity, which is going to be an extension of what's already brought, and competing progressivism. First of all, extraneous rebuttal. In regards to new markets, there are exactly the same incentives for smaller companies, for smaller studios, to engage with these new markets, whether they be progressive markets or new developing nations, as there are larger companies. And we don't hear any analysis from opening as to why those incentives wouldn't exist for smaller companies. Of course they would. It's making money. It's new markets, right? So we think that we, there's still the opportunity for development in that area. Also, in regards to monopolies, they try to take this weird principle stance where we should never interfere and break up companies at all. But there is a precedent for states to break up large corporations or to stop large mergers within them. In the United Kingdom, a monopoly is counted as something that has 25% of the market share. And it's been broadly agreed that Disney has 40%. And the reason for that is because it can start to manipulate the market to its favour and to take advantage. There are lots of recent mergers that have been blocked in the United Kingdom because of that law. We think that there is a precedent, and we think that it is legitimately correct. So, we also have no problem with breaking up other companies, but that's not this debate. This debate is about Disney. So risks. So we hear that Disney is capable of taking big risks. But as I pointed out in the POI, they don't really. Black Panther and Star Wars don't really count because they're existing intellectual properties with existing fan bases. And so they're not really a huge existing fan bases and storylines. They're not really a big risk, and also they don't actually represent what the lives are for the majority of black people in the world. No black people are the kings of secret wealthy nations in Africa, right? That's not a risk. Okay, that isn't a risk. That isn't a groundbreaking. It isn't insightful. It isn't deep, right? It's just an action film with a black person leading it, and that is fine, but that is not meaningful representation, and we get that. We're actually going to get that on our side of the house. Meaningful representation is actually like something that is important to aim for, because it helps people who are of underrepresented communities better understand themselves and better understand the societies that they live in, and better understand us, and for other people to better understand them as well. It leads to better cohesion, right? It is incredibly important that we don't just have black faces on generic scripts. Stifling creativity. Yes, Disney doesn't have great social values. This is going to be an extension for opening. I'm going to tell you why smaller companies have like incentives to have better values. Because rather than a single mega corporation that saturates the market and produces film after film after film every year, you're going to have smaller companies who are going to want to compete with each other. And in order to compete with each other, they're going to have to differentiate themselves. You can't just have the same sort of like action movies aimed at the same audience. You can't just have Star Wars and like a big Marvel film released in the same year just being like generic action films, as sort of like they are at the moment. You're going to have to do something new and interesting, and that's going to create actual it's going to create much better media, like much better quality media, because people will be taking risks. People will be more likely to take risks so that they can get ahead and get the advantage. It also means they're more likely to be more progressive, because that's, again, seen as a risk, but there is, as we've pointed out, a market to tap into if they want to. They're more likely to be progressive because individuals within those companies, the writers, the directors themselves, they're not just like a tiny cog in a big machine. They're a medium-sized cog in a smaller machine. They have more influence. If they want to take it in another direction, it has more of themselves in it. And if they're a minority writer, if they're a woman writer, for example, that's going to show in those films as well. And so we're going to see actual better creativity. Before I go on, I'll take closing.
Okay, so meaningful representation is not just about like showing a child exactly how they are. Meaningful representation, such as Black Panther, showing a young black child they can be a hero too, they can be powerful too, they can be brave too. That's why this is meaningful representation.
Okay, but the only type of representation that we get under the status quo is representation where we get like a minority character over like cast in like a generic role. So like something like Black Panther, where they're just a superhero, right? On our side of the house, we'd probably get that as well, because as we said, we've got a multitude of companies competing, and that's still an area of the market that at least some of those companies will want to tap. But also, because other companies will be trying to go for other areas of the market, we're more likely to get actual sort of more meaningful representation too. And meaningful representation isn't just seeing people seeing how their lives are exactly. It's also But people from similar backgrounds to them, people with similar life experiences to them, doing something or making a difference or struggling through something. Sorry. That's not something that happens in Black Panther, because as I said, unless anybody happens to know any African princes, that's not something that is relevant to most people's lives. No. Competing progressivism. Disney is so big that it's probably difficult to work for somebody else within that industry. If you wanted to leave your job for whatever reason, right? Maybe, yes, I'm not denying that there are other companies, but because there aren't. But in our side of the house, we get even more companies, which would be even better. So yeah, there are only so many jobs in the Disney industry anyway. So this means that Disney can more easily exploit their workers by underpaying them or giving them poor conditions, etc. So it looks like poor conditions and lower wages. In a world where we have multiple competing companies, it's likely that in order to attract the best writers, the best actors and stuff like that, they'll increase the quality of the conditions, they'll increase the quality of the pay. So, because it's not just, oh, I'm Disney and I want to employ you, and you kind of have to say yes because there aren't that many other companies. There's a load of other companies that you can work for, and you can go over there. But importantly as well, we should also consider the impact of this on sexual assault. And in the era of Me Too, it's a ridiculously bad idea to have one company that has so much power and that can that has so much power and influence and takes up so many of the jobs. If you're somebody who has been sexually assaulted within Disney, within the structures, maybe you don't feel comfortable calling them out because they're a big company and they have a lot of lawyers, as has been pointed out. So instead of that, you might want to leave your job. But when Disney controls so much of the market, you wouldn't want to move to another Disney job, right? But if you are, say, a victim of that sexual assault in a smaller company. There are other companies that you can go and work for, and it isn't as scary to call them out if you actually wanted to go ahead and do that, because they aren't as like these big monolith mega corporations. So for those reasons, I beg you to propose this motion.
I'd like to propose and I'd like to invite the third opposition.
No. We're not running Disneyland. Ready, panel? Panel, ladies and gentlemen, to all our fans at home, 3 things in this speech today. First of all, we can explain to you why Disney is more like to take risks on our side of the house, and through 2 mechanisms that we don't think OO fully explain, and I'm going to explain to you why we also get better quality films. Because in order for you to access representation, you need to fulfill the idea of entertainment, which is why people watch movies in the first place, right? There is no point in saying we have this lovely message if no one comes to watch your films. I think that's incredibly important. I don't know why no other team has touched it. Before that, though, one very important piece of rebuttal. And the idea that Disney has a monopoly does not necessarily mean they do not have an incentive to innovate, right? I think the biggest reason why they have the incentive to innovate is because they're not competing against other studios, they're competing against Netflix. Given that we live in a world where most people have more money and can afford in-home cinema, right? The thing is, if you can afford Netflix, which pulls literally so many small studios into one big accessible thing for you at home in TV, where you can watch your films, where you can watch so many films of so many different representation, is obviously in Disney's interest, who mainly produce films in cinemas for you to go to watch, to obviously innovate, right? Because the comparative is, if you don't innovate, Netflix, which so many people has access to, but also so many people are watching to because they don't want to go out to watch a movie, they want to stay at home and have a nice meal and watch a movie, right? I think the incentive is Disney has an extremely big incentive to try and capture this audience. Therefore, they have an incentive to innovate because Netflix exists, right? Onto most of my ideas will be integrated, but before, also, I really want to point out an important idea. It takes hundreds of millions of dollars to make a movie. I don't understand why no other team has gotten this concept, but we're not talking about the incentive, because I think it's obviously given the world that we live in, it's obviously the incentive of every single company to try and be more representative. The question in this debate is, do companies have the means of being representative? Do they have the means of affording the possible shortfall at the point that a movie that tries to show Black Ariel, if it fails, right? That's what we think this question is about. First of all, on taking risks. I think OO says that Disney can afford to take risks because they have a lot of money, right? I don't think this is the main they'll explain to you why you get this mechanism. The mechanism panel is that because Disney owns so many small studios, that means that overall they can allocate and move, it's cross subsidies, right? You can move budgets in between different studios, right? So what this means, therefore, if Lucasfilm Studios have made a few bad Star Wars movies, which I think they recently have, what that means is that if Lucasfilm is doing poor, you can still afford to have a new Star Wars movie because you can take the profit that comes out of 20th Century Fox, you can take the profits that come out of your other small studios into channeling the budget for your future films, right? That is the mechanism that OO fails to explain. But first of all, right, so what does taking risks actually mean? I think in the point of representation, this is roughly the implicit metric that we've all accepted, but why is representation important, right? Representation is important because if you are someone, right, you feel, if you're a Black person and or Asian person, you've never seen yourself in film, right? You feel unwanted, you feel not a part of society that people tell you about, right? Like you don't feel important, you don't feel wanted, right? Like the comparative is when Black Panther starts coming out, when Black Ariel starts coming out, when the live action remake of Mulan starts coming out, if you're part of these minorities, you start feeling represented because you see someone of your own color, of own your race succeeding, but more importantly, the fact that you are now visible is very important in legitimizing your identity, right? That is why representation is important. Why do we get more representation outside the house? And this is different to what OO brings, right? The point that you have more money means 2 things. First of all, you can, as a Disney, you can do more headhunting, you can scout more talent, right? And this is important because insofar that good actors, it's hard to define a good actor, but there is some kind of metric, right? At the point that you have more pool of good actors because you have more money to incentivize them to come into your job because you have bigger contracts, that means that you can get better actors to play representation in better ways, right? Which means that the outcome of your message is more useful. Secondly, at the point that you're trying to sell controversial films to the public, you need ad campaigns to sell this film to the people to be receptive, right? The thing is, comparative on their side of the house, the reason why Black Ariel is not it's controversial because no one really we don't, even if we have ad campaigns, if we put tons of money into ad campaigns, they might not work. But the comparative is it might work in outside house because we have more money, which means you can sell controversial films to people and it might actually work. Right? Before, more important, right? Representation is important insofar that you are able to access the people, you access more people watching that film, right? I think at the point that you get more money, that actually is a good thing because Disney doesn't lobby for less taxes, right? Disney lobbies things like, I don't know, because the Chinese market only allows certain international films, a set number of international films being set. At the point that Disney has more money, they can lobby to access newer markets, right? Sell to China, our film is so important, but also we'll give you this amount of money to showcase our film, which means therefore that you can access newer markets and by extension get the message of your representation out, right? The importance of representation is important only insofar that people can access your films. When they can't access your films on their side, on their side of the house, that's when it gets worse. Secondly, I guess it's important, right? Trailblazing. Because Disney has the ability to afford billions of dollars and to pump it into films, right? The thing is that again, this is comparative, right? The comparative is every single company out there who makes films probably want to be more representative. They want to have a black leading cast. They want to showcase LGBT rights. The reason why they don't do so is because at the point that they enter uncharted territories and their film flunks, that could mean the end of their entire company, right? The comparative is when Disney has more money, right? Disney has more money, and therefore they can safeguard against any potential shocks. But the importance is at the point that we see Black Panther succeed, right? At the point that we see live action make Mulan succeed, that signals to other film companies, small film companies, that this is now successful, right? We are able to show to make these movies that cast LGBT actors, that cast minority actors, and still be successful. Right? It sends a signaling message that people want these films, right? And Disney helps test the waters. And when we've seen that they've tested the water successfully, and people are actually receptive to this kind of films, I think that's when you get a general trend, a change in the actual film industry, right? That's when people actually realize that wow, these films are good. That's when every single filmmaker out there now has active incentive to actively prioritize casting these actors. Before I move on, OG, go.
Free publicity, replacement of potential lost viewership in new markets, and fewer ties to an entrenched bare image. We gave you 3 incentives why broken up studios have more ground to break through compared to Disney.
Again, this debate is not about incentives, because I think incentives are one of the priorities. This debate is about the means to fulfill that incentive, right? Recognize that. I don't think their case stands. Thirdly, quality films, right? Recognize that in order for you to access representation, you need to have good films that people want to watch, right? The reason why that exists in the outside house is because at the point you have more money, you're able to invest in more innovation and more technology that actually makes your film more appealable to the vast majority of the people. 2 reasons to why this is true. Number 1, more money means you can have more tech that actually fulfills that cinema experience. We've seen this in the past, right? Disney was one of the pioneers of 3D glasses. Film industry, they're one of the pioneers of IMAX cinemas. Those are really important in getting people to come to watch your films and also watching the films in a very enjoyable experience, which means that they actually internalize the message of the representation. Secondly, right, animation is important, right? Insofar that animation is a very competitive industry. As if you don't go to Disney, you can go to anime, you can go to small other local studios, right? The fact is, at the point that Disney has so much more money, that means 2 things. First of all, they have more pulling power because they offer more satisfying job contracts or buy job contracts to people. But secondly, also, even if your film industry, if you make poor films for 5 runs in a row, the thing is you still have some kind of job security because Disney provides that money to you, which means that in the long run, animators learn and grow, and that's how you actually get more innovation. Panel, because we win on representation and entertainment, we're very proud to oppose.
And now to invite the last speaker for the
In this SWIP speech, and do firstly a quick summary of what Danny told you. So explain why, and with thorough analysis on each of those, why they those specific points win over each of the teams that we've seen before. So there are 3 things on risk, creativity, and wages. Opening government told us that Disney previously has only been progressive when it's possible. When it's been profitable, it's not was not necessarily clear why breaking up Disney would necessarily stop that incentive. What Danny tells you is he provides a mechanism on how smaller companies are more likely to make progressive films. Look, we point out that yes, like Black Panther is a great film. However, like that's the one one of the few like progressive films that Disney knows or that people like know about that Disney has produced. No, thank you. Because when you have now lots of smaller companies who like saw maybe Black Panther was successful and saw that progressive films have been successful, they're now competing to be also have progressive films. None of those companies want to be the one studio that doesn't produce diverse films, because I think that looks particularly bad on them. Because in comparison, the comparison is you have lots of companies all trying to make progressive films, and you have able to reach a wide range of markets because because they're all trying to become as profitable as possible. In comparison to Disney, who makes fewer progressive films that aren't actually as represent groups well. Why is this? It's because they make they have just such a large incentive to make all of that profit. They try to make a film that caters for everyone. Hence, as Danny pointed out, that is just a generic superhero film who has a black cast. We point out that this is not good enough. Look, no, thank you. Look, opening opposition told us, look, there's going to be greater diversity because they're producing more films and and they will have an incentive to reach other markets. We point out that this same analysis also applies for smaller companies. Those small companies also have an incentive to try and cater for a specific niche. We think that when they do this, it's easier for them to no, thank you. To have it's easier for them to better represent the lives of that particular group even more effectively. It's because it's focusing on a specific group. If that group's smaller, because then maybe they're able to corner that market rather than Disney being forced to make a few number of films and represent all people badly. When we have lots of different markets cornered by lots of different companies, and each of one of those companies is representing those groups well, now we get better representation for more groups, and all of them are representing well, rather than just one blanket brush for all. Yes.
Why are standard contract law clauses of non-compete, or the fact that small companies can do what Disney does just as well as Disney, sufficient for the state to go and break it up?
Look, we think the state has a right to break up companies when they think that it is harming the people in those countries to a significant amount. We I think it's up for the state to decide at what level that comes in. But I think as soon as a company starts putting its profits over the quality of lives of people who consume their media, we think that's necessarily a good thing. Look, they first told us that look, as I said, studios can then cater for that niche, and because these films have actually, no, I've already said that. Never mind. But, no, thank you. Because they have a niche, they can use that better. They can get those hang on to those markets. Closing opposition told us that look, it requires money to do these things. It requires better actors. It requires new technology. We point out that just because Disney's broken up, it doesn't mean that Marvel now has hardly any money at all. These companies are still multi-million pound organizations. Just because they are broken up, they're still huge. Like Marvel is still loved by millions of people, just because it's not apart from Disney. Because people like Marvel films, but they hate things like Frozen. So just because they have that much, just because there's so much money in the industry, they can still have the ability to hire the best actors simply because of how much money is in this. No, thank you. Is in the system. Look, even if we are talking about risk, a film that flops still makes millions and millions of pounds. They still have an incentive to try and make diverse films because of the fact that because of the fact that they seem that they're part of the market that they have cornered, and they're able to do those things well. Look, finally, on why it's harder for people to leave and things like that. Look, it would point out that it's harder for people to leave simply because. For many of the similar reasons as opening government. But what Danny also points out is the fact that, firstly, it's yes, they have their good, lots of amazing lawyers that stop things from coming out. But also, it's about when the company is so huge, and all of your peers and all of your contemporaries also work for the same company. It's hard to you not necessarily want to associate yourself with that company or with those same people. It becomes increasingly hard for you to work with any other person in the film industry, just because they're all associated and all tainted with a company that has done you so wrong. That you can only get remove this when you have other companies that are separate from Disney, and you can move to them instead. For these reasons, I beg you to propose this motion.
I'd like to thank you very much for the speech, and now invite the last speaker for the opposition.
Sound good? Chair, adjudicators, and all the lovely people watching at home, what we bring you uniquely from closing opposition is the most important point in this debate. How Disney uniquely is able to provide representation and provide entertainment in order to get proper impacts for young children who do not see themselves in movies. First, a note on what Alex brought in terms of frame, which went unresponded to. What actually changes in this debate? Because notice that Alex tells you specifically that even if we take all of them at their best and pretend that all these other studios don't exist, Disney is competing with Netflix. It means Disney still has an incentive to innovate, because it's very hard to get people from just sitting on their couch watching Netflix movies to pay $10, to pay €10 to get out of their house and actually go into the cinema. This means they still have to innovate a lot. The only thing that changes in this debate, because all their analysis about monopolies and controlling markets doesn't really exist, the only thing that changes is that you get no cross-subsidization. It means when one company fails or one company does badly, it means they can take less risks in the future. It means they cannot protect themselves from risk. They cannot have the security blanket to protect themselves. It means when competition eliminates all their profits because they're trying to reduce costs and try to be as efficient as possible, they cannot fund things like taking risks on new actors which provide representation. They cannot fund things like new technology which provides more entertainment. That's really not ideal. Okay, firstly I'm going to talk about opening government, then closing government, then our case. Two responses to opening government. First of all, when they talk about incentives of Disney and how it's probably going to lead to less progressiveness. Listen, I think we've already won this just by playing example tennis and by showing you specifically how Disney has been changing recently. But note that they kind of undercut their own analysis at the point in which they say that Disney wants to emerge into new markets and wants to provide representation, and so they are moved by profit. I think if you're weighing up which incentive Disney will actually follow, when we tell you can break into the Chinese market and you can get a new representation, I think that is a lot stronger of incentive than what they provide, which is pretty much, Walt Disney was anti-Semitic, therefore yada yada yada, Disney is probably going to be anti-progressive. I don't think that stands this debate. Then their second point about lobbying. Listen, does not stand this debate. Why it's completely non-comparative. First of all, they have to prove why specifically, if I think what would actually happen if you break up Disney is that Marvel and Sony would just say to each other, or Marvel and Lucasfilm would say to each other, oh hey, we also don't want, no thank you, we also don't want the public domain to be such a short time. Let's just put our money together and then make sure it doesn't come into force. I don't actually understand why specifically Disney having so much money will change it. Because note, on the other side of this argument, apparently there isn't any backing for because like how lobbying works is you pretty much pay money so the politician will support your case. But like that means you have to pay more than anyone else. I don't know who's on the other side of this lobbying fight who's paying to keep public domain short. So that means that on their side of the house, you just have all these small companies doing it themselves or working together. So lobbying is still short. Also, on the point about unionization, listen, minimum wages are defined by the entire economy. Working hours are defined by the entire economy. Even if you assume and take all those assertions at their best that Disney has influence over the film industry, it doesn't change working conditions because it's not a monopoly. 3 responses to closing government. First of all, they're kind of mitigatory stuff about how apparently these aren't proper risks. Listen, at their very best, they say, listen, Black Panther, it's not relatable, so it's not meaningful representation. Even if it's very generic, even if it's just as stupid and very clear and very intuitive. That is the first time a black child is seeing themselves being seen as a hero. Even if like to us, it might be seen as generic because we grew up watching loads of superheroos that look exactly like us. It means a lot to a black child. It means a lot to people like Alex who grew up without seeing any Asian representation on screen. Listen, I think also at the point in which they admit that the only representation they get is niche markets is catering to niche markets and finding a niche. That is still worse because kids don't watch Moonlight. Kids don't watch Call Me By Your Name. Kids don't watch that sort of representation. What you need is generic. What you need is simple because that's what kids watch. Kids need to see themselves being a hero. That is better. On their case about competition being better, listen, I think all the incentives to make competition better, for example, like how you want to rise up in the firm, how you want to not sit on your laurels, I think this can just exist artificially. That's why Disney keeps Marvel and Lucasfilm very separate. They don't really swap rides between them. They say if you want to have more money, then you should make the best. If you want to have a budget for your film for Star Wars instead of Marvel, then you have to make the best film you possibly can be. Disney artificially creates these incentives to be as profitable as possible because they know it's very profitable because they know that's what makes the best films. They still do this. Also, first of all, I told you why this competition still exists, why you still have a lot of competition, or why you still have these incentives. Third thing they bring is about jobs in the economy, about how, they've got so much incentives, now you can underpay people, and now you have no protection from sexual assault. First thing is, listen, at their very best, it's 40% of the industry. There's another 60% you can go to. I don't think it's a huge thing. Secondly, leave the industry. If you are a writer for film, you can be a writer for TV. There is a lot of mobility of labour. I'm not sure exactly why you are completely stuck in it. Thirdly, on sexual assault. I'm not exactly sure why a vulnerable intern who is sexually assaulted by a Disney executive and is too scared to fight against Disney will be fine fighting against Marvel. I don't think they explain that link. It's not comparative at all. Secondly, I think actually sexual assault gets worse on their side house when each executive is more important. That means if an executive for Marvel, when there's only 5 or 6 of the highest ranking executive sexually assault someone, they're more likely to cover it up because it's so important. When Disney has 30 people at that level, then they can lose that person. It's fine to throw them out. That means on their side, you get more covering up, which is bad. Opening.
The ability to diversify is increased without copyright restriction and an entrenched brand image.
I absolutely agree, but you did not prove why you get less copyrights to restriction. What realistically will happen is that Marvel will just pay it. I agree with that. Okay. Why do you get better representation? First of all, entertainment. It means you need to access people. Why do we get this? First of all, Disney can invest in technology. Second of all, Disney can invest in animations. What they say is, on the comparative, you have more competition, which means you're less likely to take risks. That means when you have money, you're going to spend it on the best actor. You're going to buy Brad Pitt instead of a new animation studio because it's secure, because it takes less risk. It means you're not likely to spend things on long-term issues. For example, animation studios. Why does taking risks not happen in status quo? Because you can't. It means when Marvel made a lot of failed movies in the 2000s, they had to sell themselves to Disney. This means when the Lucasfilms prequels failed, they sold themselves to Disney. Because when Lucasfilms was on their own, as they want to be on their side of the house, it means that it couldn't survive. Because when you make bad films, there's no one there to support you. There's no security blanket. If Black Panther had failed, then money from Beauty and the Beast exists. Money from Inside Out exists. Money from Star Wars exists. You get cross-subsidization. Their side, if it fails, you may have less money for the next film. So in the film you make after that, you'd be even safer. You take even less risks. You have even less representation. How do you get good representation as gives you 4 reasons I respond to. First of all, talent scouting. Second of all, ad campaigns. Because on their side, you just pick something that sells itself. The new Star Wars film would just be, oh, come watch Han Solo again. Because they can't advertise new characters people don't already know. You can show people new stories with ad campaigns. Third of all, new market. You lobby to get into China and Saudi Arabia. Fourth of all, trailblazers. If Black Panther hadn't existed, then Sony would not have announced that they're casting a black James Bond because they wouldn't take the risk that a black film can be so popular. I think what this means is that for young people like Alex, you can see yourself being a hero. You can see yourself visible. You can see your identity being verified, being legitimized. I think this means that you get better representation because of the unique mechanism we give. I beg you to oppose.